So I occasionally get a model that comes out of nowhere and makes me do a double take. In this case, it's the Savage Bobber from Legend Hobbies. And despite its looks, it's a real aircraft made by Zlin Aviation out of the Czech Republic. Now, it's a light sport aircraft where it looks like they finished the wings and tail but just kind of gave up on the rest. Or as a friend of mine remarked, it's a Piper Cub after being attacked by a bear. Well, anyways, let's see if this thing is a bear to build. Get it? Get it? Ha 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 ha! Hi, Kilby. Vertical tail and fin are a mixture of built-up and sheeted surfaces covered in heat shrink film, with carbon alignment pins and large point hinges. Horizontal tail is all built-up structure with a cutout for the servos. Interesting that the tail roots have a hard mounting plate and alignment pin. Built-up wing spar appear to be traditional D-tube construction with flaps and ailerons. I like that there's a nice metal wing bolt that can be hand tightened. Bottom of the wing has a snazzy two-tone seam with trim. Inside the servo cavities are channel tubes for servo wires. Fiberglass cowl seems well built and durable. But I did notice what looked like a slight marring of the paint by the bubble wrap, suggesting the paint wasn't fully cured when packaged. The most interesting feature of the model, of course, is the fuselage. Firewall is thick plywood with more two-tone covering on the side. All the truss work is welded metal painted black and is rather intricate. There are also some painted wood interfaces for the wings and tail. Weight of the whole assembly seemed quite reasonable. My model had one weld joint that looked a bit inelegant, but it still seemed structurally sound. But check out the optional seats. They have simulated leather and even thread seams. Saddlebags are even more impressive with embossed labeling. And functional straps. Yes, they can actually hold stuff. The foam wheels are, well, big and round, and hard, and ball bearinged, which is nice. Diameter just over 7 inches, and almost 5 in width. Undercarriage is also all metal welded truss work, with functional springs and threaded axles. Control panel is really impressive with very realistic instrument bezels, and even a receiver power switch. That gives me an idea, which I'll get to later. The kit includes an interesting bag of goodies that contains servo lead extensions and metal control horns. Manual is full color and has numerous photos, though the text is somewhat sparse. Interesting that control throws are in degrees instead of distance measurements. Alright, so assembly starts with the undercarriage, where the huge wheels are installed by sliding into threaded shafts, and held into place with lock nuts. There is a bit of shaft sticking out that can be cut off with a rotary tool. The whole assembly fits into slots in the fuselage underside. After some convincing with a hammer and scrap wood. Metal strips hold the assembly in place. There is a wing strut that is then screwed down, though at first I mounted it in the wrong spot due to me not paying attention. Anyways, time to glue on the tail. First, I sanded off a bit of the paint before adding generous amounts of 30-minute epoxy, which is cleaned up with some alcohol. The hinges don't come glued in, so I first added some grease to the joints to prevent the glue from sticking to the joints. Also, one of the holes wasn't quite large enough in the tail, so it had to be drilled out slightly. Then more 30-minute epoxy to glue the assembly together. I prefer to use 30-minute epoxy to give maximum working time. Same process is used for the ailerons. Next is mounting a steering bracket onto the rudder. I like to harden the screw holes in the wood with thin CA glue. Tailwheel mount is done in the same way. The barrel connectors for the brackets needed the holes to be drilled out slightly as well. You will have to use thread lock on the nuts to prevent them from falling off. Tail wheel is spring-loaded with 2 springs, which I found is best to preload the springs when mounting. Now the horizontal tail can be test mounted. I'll get to the tail servos later. First, we attach the flaps, which will use these neat offset hinges. A nice touch is the holes are pre-drilled into the flaps. All the control arms seem to be made from some sort of carbon or carbon fiber-like material. And yes, that is 30-minute epoxy. You'll need to glue the servo mounting blocks to the plate. So I marked the locations with a pencil before gluing with, well, you know. I should point out that all the servos I'll be using are the high-tech 645 high voltage. These will allow me to use 2-cell lithium batteries without the need of a voltage regulator. Remember those metal control horns mentioned earlier? Well, they fit perfectly onto the high-tech servos. Except the fact I forgot to compensate for the rubber grommet thickness and needed to trim the blocks down a bit. Now I could use those as servo extensions and feed them through the wing tubes. And attach the control rods with screws. I like how the setup uses heavy-duty components. Wing struts also use hand-tightened screws. But the joining brackets are assembled with small screws and nuts. Again, thread lock will be used before flight. Alright, let's throw the wing tubes in and slide the wings on. More hand-tightened screws are used to fix the struts to the fuselage. Cockpit area has mounting plates that are attached with zip ties for the seats. But the plate for the rudder servo will need something more secure in mounting. Sand off some paint, add some epoxy, clamp on the plate, and glue on the inner supports. More clamps, and while that cures, add some zip ties for good luck. There is a rather large plate for the servo that must be screwed onto a stock servo arm. To do this, I'll be using some small screws from RTL Fasteners. More info about them and specials in the video description. Alright, before mounting the servo, time to make up the rudder pull-pull wires. They are pretty easy to fabricate, but you'll need to make 4 sets. A double jointed set of pliers makes a good crimping tool. I also added some heat shrink tubing to clean up the exposed wire ends. Now is a good time to mount the rudder servo. And ball link connectors. The other ends will have to be made up last. Some plastic tubes are used to make a conduit, which look really familiar. Ah! Tapioca drink straws. Very clever, Mr. Bond. Anyways, the straws are inserted to each other with tape to make a long tube for the servo wires. Now the tail servos are installed, which is easier with the stabs removed. With the airframe pretty much done, it's on to installing the engine. In this case, a side exhaust RCGF Stinger 35cc gas engine. These are great engines, and I've had several of them. I like to remove the small throttle arm and replace it with a longer arm, as it helps prevent interference with the choke control. Engine Instructions has a drill template which I scanned and printed out at full scale. This paper template is aligned with the crosshairs on the firewall, and the drill points are marked. The firewall has no offset, so flat mounting the engine will not be correct. Fortunately, the manual has the proper right and down offsets noted. I needed to make some measurements and use some high school geometry to work out the offset dimensions. Which I used to find some fender washers of the correct thickness. There, much better. Plus, the cowl now fits better. Okay, now to fit the throttle cable. And mount the throttle servo tray. It's a pretty awkward location to screw in, so I marked the location with tape and drilled a couple of pilot holes from the inside. Then mounted the tray outside to use as a template for the other holes. Of course, dumb me misdrilled a couple of holes, but I'll cover up my mistake later. The tail has guide wires that also must be fabricated from components. Some of which look like they were from fishing parts. I should note that these guides are structurally supporting. So, back to the control panel. It didn't quite fit how I'd like, so I notched the corners for a better fit. Oh yeah, much better. The kit does not come with a fuel tank, so I got this Fortitude RC tank from Legend Hobby. This tank will need to be assembled from parts. A little oil on the rubber seal helps prevent leaks. There are a couple of plastic tubes that are glued in with medium CA after being cleaned and scuffed up with sandpaper. Okay, back to the engine. With the muffler on, it's time to fit the cowl. The side exhaust almost fits, but not quite. So I made a mark where I should start cutting around the muffler. Hey, not bad. Just needs a little cleanup with a file. Next to drill for the mounting screws. I like to use special rubber bonded washers from RTL fasteners. These hold really well without damaging the fiberglass. Another hole is made for the exhaust tube using a large step drill. I needed to remove the top plate so as to install the gas tank. Instructions were a little bit vague on how to install the tank, so I screwed down a pair of Velcro strips to hold the tank. Remember those misdrilled holes? Well, one became the refueling port, and the other will be covered up with a decal. We finally get to the seats. Pilot seat is attached with screws onto the top of the plate I just removed. The rear seat is more tricky as it attached with zip files to a non-flat surface. I did it by drilling pilot holes spaced apart, then pre-bend a zip tie. Then use a hobby knife as a guide to fish it out the other side. Patience and perseverance is the key to success. And attach to the frame. The saddlebags went much easier. To spice things up, I decided to feed the choke control through the control panel, as the semi-open cockpit will make for easy access. A wheel collar makes a great knob. While I was at it, I thought I'd use a Dubro quick switch on the ignition switch. And also mount it to the control panel. It's almost like a real airplane now. Master power, ignition, and choke on the control panel. Dummy engine cylinders are mostly laminated wood pieces and is glued onto the cowl with canopy glue. Some tape holds it in place while it sets. The windshield comes pretty tightly wrapped, which proved to be a bit of a problem. Like, really annoying. Even with tape. Dang it! But I eventually got it screwed down. Strategic decal placement covers up the enormous screw hole. Alright, so let's put it all back together. Foam wrap receiver is affixed on the plate next to the rudder servo. I used some cable wrap to help hide the wires around the frame. The Savage Bobber is finally ready. Thanks for watching, and look for part 2 where we go fly this thing. Hi, thanks for watching. Please take a look at the video description below for special HobbyView sales and discounts. Your purchases help support this channel. Happy modeling!